It's Friday the 19th of June, and this is your Capital Economics Weekly Briefing. I'm David Wilder, and joining me is Group Chief Economist Neil Shearing, once again to wade through a very busy week in global macro and markets. Hi Neil, is it hot enough for you?
It's hot enough, and it's getting hotter. I think the weekend in London is looking like it's going to be a scorcher.
It is indeed. Coming into this, I was going to ask if oil prices had come off far too quickly given the uncertainties around this very much unloved US-Iran peace deal. Now we've got news that this first round of direct US-Iran talks in Switzerland have been called off. It kind of drives home the precariousness of this situation, right?
It does, and I think it underscores a point that we've made all along. Indeed, I made in the note we published on Monday morning, which is although the deal itself diminishes the risk of very adverse scenarios developing in the coming months, it's really a fragile truce, and it wouldn't take much for the whole thing to unravel. Now, I don't think we're there yet, but it does speak, as you say, to the fragility of the situation. And I think it's striking that seemingly the talks were postponed, not cancelled. So presumably both sides believe this is salvageable and that the talks will continue and that a deal will ultimately be done. But also I think it's striking that the reason they were postponed was allegedly conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. And that was one of the areas that we pointed to as potentially a flashpoint that could undermine the deal. So I think both sides are still trying to push towards a deal. It's in both sides' interest to get a deal. It's striking, as I say, that they're postpone the talks rather than cancel them altogether, but it also speaks to the fragility of the situation.
Oil prices fell sharply as news of the deal kind of filtered through, was confirmed. Trump signs the deal. First words out of his mouth are oil down, stocks up. But given all that you've said, do you think the market's gone too far in this? I noticed from my Strait of Hormuz traffic tracker that no ships have officially transited over the last 24 hours.
I think it's an incredibly difficult thing for markets to price because on the one hand, there's a clear push from both sides to get a deal done and to get the straits reopened. On the other, that has been slow so far, as you say, no traffic over the last 24 hours seemingly. And the constraints and strains in the physical market are at risk of becoming quite acute. So we've talked before about how there's been a very rapid drawdown of stocks both in the OECD countries but also in China, and that's helped to maintain a supply of energy and oil in particular throughout this crisis. And clearly there are limits on the extent to which that can continue, and we might be getting to the point where the current rate of drawdown stocks would be at quote-unquote critical levels consistent with, in past form, prices well above $100 a barrel. So I think markets are have bought into the idea that the strait will be reopened. But the flip side of that is if it's not reopened, then we could quite quickly end up in a situation where there are very severe constraints and strains in the physical market.
One of the just to move on a bit, but one of the themes of this podcast over the past few weeks has been pity the poor central banker, because they are grappling with these uncertainties. They see inflation coming through, but so much is dependent on energy flowing back through the Strait of Hormuz, which is dependent on diplomatic breakthroughs. We're just at the end of a series of critical central bank meetings. We've had Bank of Japan, we've had the Fed. I mean, you name the central bank, they've met over the past few days. What are the big takeaways from those meetings, do you think? How do you think they're handling this uncertainty?
Well, at the risk of stating the obvious, they all refer to heightened levels of uncertainty. There's not much use for investors that are trying to figure out how central bank policy might shift over the coming months. So let's try to shed a bit of light on that. The first point I think to make is that different central banks have responded in different ways. Bank of Japan have hiked as expected. The ECB hiked too as expected. The Bank of England held rates but delivered a relatively hawkish message. And so did the Fed in what was Kevin Warsh's first FOMC meeting as chair. So different responses by different central banks, and that speaks to a difference in economic conditions, the underlying economic conditions, different starting points for policies, different institutional responses and biases around inflation too. I think it's also worth noting that while some central banks in the emerging world have hiked rates, others have cut rates over the past week. So we've had Indonesia's central bank hiking and Brazil's central bank cutting. Now, without just resorting to, well, the outlook's incredibly uncertain, difficult to see what happens from here, let's try and organise a framework for thinking around how central banks might direct policy over the coming months. I think you can basically place central banks into one of four buckets. The first is central banks, particularly those in the emerging world, that were going to have to hike interest rates really for defensive purposes, because they were either concerned about inflation expectations becoming very unanchored, or because they were worried about pressure on their currencies and via the balance of payments shock. And so into that mix, you would put kind of countries like Turkey, Pakistan, actually Indonesia would probably fall into that category. In those central banks, I think we're going to have policy on hold now, assuming this deal is kind of ultimately done, the straits reopen, policy stays on hold rather than having what economists would call defensive rate hikes. Then you have a group of countries where, with the threat of the strait being closed and energy supplies being constrained, apparently lifting, and the inflationary consequences of that easing, they can actually start to loosen policy. These are countries that have either seen a sharp appreciation of their currencies in recent weeks for reasons separate to the crisis, so Hungary's one, or they have real interest rates that are very high by historic standards, so Brazil, Colombia would be another. So Hungary, Brazil, Colombia, even Russia, I think we could get rate cuts over the coming months. Then you get to the developed market central banks, the world's major developed market central banks. And I think they fall into the kind of third and fourth buckets here. The first is central banks that have more work to do to tighten policy, not because of the energy crisis stemming from the war in Iran, but because their economies are just in strong cyclical positions. There's not much slack in the labour markets. Policy might be starting from a very loose position. So the Bank of Japan's falls into this category. We've got rates there rising to 2% by the end of the next year. The RBA would be another central bank in this box. And then the fourth category is those central banks that were potentially thinking about having to tighten policy because of the surge in energy inflation, the impact on inflation expectations, but now will be more comfortable looking through the energy shock and may even start to reverse some of those hikes. So ECB's hike rates, I think they could start reversing those hikes next year. The Bank of England will continue to look through this energy price shock, I think, as will Sweden's Riksbank, as will the SNB that's also met over the past week or so. So you got four groups of central banks there. EM central banks that may have had to hike rates in order to defend their currencies that now no longer have to. Some central banks that now would otherwise have been cutting interest rates and now can resume those cuts. Brazil's a good example there. Some DM central banks that will just have to keep tightening policy and raising interest rates because of underlying macro conditions and tightness in the labour market, for example, Bank of Japan, Reserve Bank of Australia, and then DM central banks that can now just be a bit more comfortable looking through the energy price shock and may even start to unwind some of the tightening that they've put in place, like the ECB. Now, you'll notice in all of that, I've not talked about the Fed, and I suspect we're going to come on to the Fed, but I would put the Fed, obviously the world's most important central bank, probably in that third group of central banks, so probably need to raise interest rates a bit further.
Yeah, we will come on to that, but just to be clear before we do, the narrative when the deal got signed was, and energy prices did come off very sharply, but the point is, isn't it, that there is still inflation to work its way through the system. So this disinflationary impulse doesn't instantly come across the board, right?
Yes, that's a really good point, though I think it's wrong. Actually, in conversations with clients over the past week or so, I don't think investors are necessarily thinking this way, but some people in the financial press sometimes do, which is that the deal's done, the straits reopen, energy prices collapse, and therefore the inflation shock is over. Actually, that's not the case. We're probably quite close to seeing fuel inflation peaking in some countries if oil prices stay at these kind of levels. So gasoline prices gasoline inflation might be quite close to a peak. But other forms of inflation, jet fuel inflation, for example, might edge up a bit further from here. And in Europe, where utility prices, household utility bills, electricity bills are often priced off of natural gas prices and come through with a lag, inflation has further to rise, and that will pass through the system over the next 6 months or so. So you're right, it's wrong to think and people should not fall into the trap of thinking that straits reopening, therefore the inflation shock is over, as it were. There's still a bit more of this to come through.
Let's talk about the Fed. A lot came out of what was a relatively brief press conference. Clearly, Kevin Warsh's one of his bugbears has been if nothing else, the length of Fed communications prior to his taking over. But I guess the headline is that the communications kind of confirmed something we'd been warning clients about in recent weeks, which is that the FOMC has turned hawkish, that rate hikes are back on the table. Give us a sense of the risks of rate hikes before the end of 26. What's driving the Fed at this point?
I think the first thing to say is the change in communication style is welcome. At Capital Economics, we value brevity, we value being concise. And so cutting the FOMC statement, I know it's ruffled a few feathers, but I personally view that as a step in the right direction. As for policy itself, we might also have to get used, I think we'll probably also have to get used to the idea that it's not just the Fed funds rate that the Fed is using and the FOMC is using as a policy tool. The balance sheet will become potentially a policy tool as well, for example. But the broader point here, I think, is that the US economy itself is in a strong place. Our GDP nowcast is pointing to growth of about 3% Q-on-Q annualized in Q2. That's supported by strong investment growth, but also consumption is holding up well. The labor market is tightening. According to the latest data, we've now seen job openings pick up again, run of decent payrolls numbers too. And core PCE, which is the Fed's favored measure of inflation, is running currently 3.3% and looks like year on year, and looks like it's going to go up a bit further from here. So put all that together, and then you add into the mix that fiscal policy is supportive. So the deficit of about 6% of GDP, but probably going to be a bit higher now that we have tariff refunds exceeding tariff revenues for the first time in a year in April. Then you have a strong economy and core inflation running above the Fed's targets, the labour market tightening, and fiscal policy supportive. That's the argument, I think, for perhaps needing to raise interest rates.
You mentioned just there that the Fed's preferred core PCE measure. It may not be preferred for much longer based on what Warsh was saying, because he's announced these 5 task force looking at everything from communications that we just talked about, the size of the balance sheet, productivity and employment, but also there's this idea of his that this core PC measure might not be the best way of gauging inflationary dynamics in the US when it comes to forging policy. So all of this talk about reform, what is the outcome here in terms of tracking the Fed's appetite for raising or cutting interest rates?
Well, I think it's important to separate out where the Fed might be going over the next, say, 2 to 3 years from where policy might be heading over the next 6 months or so. So a lot of the task force are aimed at reforms that will really shape the Fed and shape Fed policy over a kind of 2, 3, 4, 5 year horizon. This is not necessarily about 2026. Now, as it happens, I'm skeptical that's going to lead to very radical change. We'll get we've seen we'll get a change in communication style. As I say, we might see greater consideration of the broader monetary toolkit, as it were. So not just the reliance on the Fed funds rate as the primary tool, but beyond that, at this stage, I think it's difficult to envisage very radical reform. Could be wrong on that, but that's just my hunch. Now, that is all, though, separate and distinct from where might policy be heading over the next 6 months? Now, it was striking that of the dot plots that we had, of course, Warsh did not, it seems, submitted his views via the dot plots. So of the 18 participants of the 19 that did submit views, 9 thought that interest rates would end the year higher, would have to go up this year. So a pretty even split on the FOMC. As it happens, that may overstate current views and leanings towards hiking rates on the FOMC at this stage, because I suspect that most of those 9 votes came from regional Fed presidents, not all of whom actually have a vote on fixing interest rates at the moment. So there's 7 non-voting members of the FOMC that includes some of the regional Fed presidents, and they tend to be a bit more hawkish, or they seem to be a bit more hawkish at this stage. So those dot plots might be overstating the risks of near-term rate hikes. However, I do think that as we look at the data coming in over the next 6 months or so, if this deal holds in the Strait of Hormuz, and the US economy kind of continues on its current trajectory. The labour market is looking quite tight. Fiscal policy is looking supportive. Core inflation pressures are building. I do think there's a likelihood that we'll get some rate hikes this year because the data, the Fed says it's data dependent. The data are going to go against the Fed, I think. And at this stage, it looks to me like they may end up hiking rates this year.
More generally, as an economic forecaster, someone who's is telling institutions how central banks are going to behave. Does a central bank that intends to issue less guidance, according to the signals we got from Warsh this week, does that make a central bank that's harder to read, or is it just a reflection of this more uncertain, this more dangerous world that we've been discussing for months on this podcast?
To be honest, I think there are probably too many hot takes on this, and there's a risk, I think, of some of the commentary becoming slightly breathless. People concerned about absence of communication from central banks and therefore not being able to work out where policy is heading in the short, medium and long term. Now, central bank communications are clearly very important, but I think there's a danger in confusing quality of communications with length of communications is the first point. So brevity, I think, as I said earlier, is good and something in capital economics that we welcome. I think it's also perhaps more important not to know exactly where the FOMC members think rates are going in a very precise way over the next 3, 6, 9, 12 months, but rather to have a good sense of their framework for thinking. As you say, we're living in a more uncertain world. So if the economy was to evolve in a certain way, how might they set policy? But if it was to evolve in a different way, how might that affect policy? Those are the kind of things that are useful, I think, as a forecaster and frankly as a market participant to know. And the distribution of views on where interest rates might be at the end of the year amongst FOMC members, there's some value to it, but frankly, these change all the time, and they're not a very good forecasting tool. And quite often, the debate becomes quite reductive and becomes about, well, the central bank says it's data dependent, and that's really not very useful because, as we all know, data is kind of backward looking, not forward looking, and policy needs to be forward looking.
I did say there was a lot going on this week, and changing the subject, we're in the midst of a 2-day meeting in Brussels with EU leaders. This China Shock 2.0 is on the agenda, and the briefing is all about how current trade tools to counter the impact of this China shock are insufficient. So I guess my question is, how far is Europe going to go to counter the China shock? And to extend that question even further, are we heading for an EU-China trade war?
Well, if you look at what the EU's done, this appears to be a case of kicking the can further down the road. It appears to have kind of delayed a confrontation with China over trade. So despite the combative rhetoric that we have seen from leaders in Europe over the past month or so, it appears they're opting for dialogue rather than immediate action. Now, reading between the lines, I suspect that reflects a difference in views about how countries should respond. Spain's taken a much less hawkish line towards China, much more accommodative position, indeed welcoming Chinese investment into the Spanish economy. Germany can't really work out exactly where it wants to be. On the one hand, it wants to protect its investments in China, and German firms have strong commercial ties with China, but on the other, it's at the sharp end of increasing competitive threats from China. And France is perhaps at the more hawkish end of the spectrum. Indeed, President Macron put global imbalances. Of course, China's a big contributor to on the surplus side to those imbalances at the top of the agenda when the G7 met this week. So the big picture is, if there's a trade war coming, then it's been delayed. But my sense is actually that the rhetoric is never going to quite meet with the reality when it comes to policy, because the EU leaders can't really get on the same page. And so that means we'll continue to see kind of targeted measures. They'll be generally implemented within the kind of confines of the rules-based global trading system, and that will amount in practice to not a great deal.
And presumably that also implies that until China reforms its own internal economy, Europe has to get used to the idea that its terms of trade will continue to erode.
Exactly. So I think the consequence of this is another headwind for growth in Europe. Now, I wouldn't go overboard on this. I don't think this is an existential threat. It perhaps knocks 0.2, 0.3 percentage points off of GDP growth in the Eurozone a year. Now, on the one hand, that's quite a big deal if you're only growing at 1% a year in the first place. But on the other, the point is you're only growing at 1% a year in the first place. The big picture is the Eurozone is lagging well behind the economic performance of, say, the US. And that's not just because of competition from China. And so we shouldn't just fixate, I think, on the kind of China shock 2.0 as the main cause of Europe's problems. That's not the case.
Okay, obviously much more to talk about on this issue in coming episodes. And there is some analysis that the Europe team has put out about all of this, which I will add to the podcast notes. But as I said, there is a lot going on this week. My final one is really for those global listeners, those weekly briefing listeners who aren't in the UK and may be wondering why there are images all over news sites of a UK politician shaking hands with somebody dressed as a rubbish bin and somebody dressed as a fox. And that is, of course, the outcome of a British by-election where basically anyone can run if they're over 18 and have paid their deposit. And this one is a constituency called Makerfield. The winner is Andy Burnham from the Labour Party, who until recently was the mayor of Manchester. Now, I'm asking about this because he's known in these parts for his comment last year that the UK shouldn't be in hock to the bond market. So for those people who aren't glued to UK party politics, but are glued to the bond market, why is this notable?
Yes, it's one of the peculiarities, isn't it, of the British political system that these unknown constituencies no one's ever heard of, suddenly there's a by-election in them and they take on both a national but also global importance. And this is one of them. And the issue here is that Andy Burnham, widely seen as perhaps the only person within the Labour Party that could successfully challenge Keir Starmer for the leadership, was sitting outside of Parliament. He was not an MP, so he could not challenge Starmer for the leadership. He's now back in Parliament, and so presumably a leadership challenge is coming down the track. Lots of media briefing in the UK that that's going to happen relatively soon. And so most informed observers would suggest now that Burnham is odds on to become the next UK Prime Minister, and that could happen quite quickly. Maybe not before the summer recess, but perhaps soon after. So hence his comments about not being in hock to the bond markets become important because it hints perhaps at the UK heading in the direction of slightly looser fiscal policy, perhaps a larger state and a more active state. Now, my own take on this is that if we've learned one thing over the past 5 years or so, is that actually you might not want to be in hock to the bond markets, but 9 times out of 10 you are in hock to the bond markets. And I suspect Andy Burnham is no different. The Burnham government will find that it's no different. So my sense is that the rhetoric will become a bit more divorced from the reality. So we'll get lots of rhetoric about the need for more spending and perhaps bigger, more active government, but in reality, that won't necessarily amount to much in terms of fiscal loosening or more activist fiscal policy. Let's wait and see on that. However, I do think it will have important implications potentially for other areas of government policy, depending on the ministers that Burnham puts in his cabinet were he to win a leadership election. In particular, the choice of chancellor could be important. If that's Ed Miliband, then the chances of kind of radical reform of the UK's energy policy, I think, for example, are pretty limited.
Neil Shearing there on just some of the big themes in a very busy week in the global economy. I said I'd add that Europe-China analysis to the podcast notes, and I will do so, along with stuff on the Fed, on what to watch around Hormuz, and a note from our UK team about this jostling for the Labour Party leadership. But that's it for this episode. We will be back next week with more from the world of macro and markets. Until then, goodbye.